Hello, I'm Jo Coburn and we're live in New York City for Climate Week. Welcome to Climate and Development Finance, What Works, brought to you by Project Syndicate and the European Investment Bank. The theme of this year's Climate Week is we can, we will, and who are we at Project Syndicate to dampen the mood? But the reality is the world is dangerously behind when it comes to climate change and progress on the Paris Agreement. What's more, people will also be putting on a brave face when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals in another part of New York this week, at the United Nations General Assembly, where there will be a difficult reality check on their progress. So, if we can really turn the tide, what needs to be done? What works and what doesn't? That's what we'll be asking today with the help of some of the most qualified people in the world. First up, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. Lawrence Tubiana, CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and Mark Malloch-Brown, former Deputy United Nations Secretary General and President of the Open Society Foundations. But the most important part of the mix is, of course, you, the audience watching both here in the room and online. You don't need to be in New York to be part of the conversation, so please do get involved using the hashtag #PSEvents. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker of the day for our keynote address. Please give a warm welcome to Thomas Östros, Vice President of the European Investment Bank.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to those of you joining us here today in New York and those of you that are joining us online. I must say that the title of today's event really appeals to me. What works? It reflects the essence of why we are here this week, to find solutions together to the challenge that we face. We don't need to convince each other that climate change is an emergency, nor that it is key for development globally. What we do need to do is to create a new momentum around the business case for global climate action. Economists like Vera Songwe, Nicholas Stern and Amar Bhattacharya estimate that the developing world needs at least $350 billion more in annual low-cost finance to bolster climate resilience and to protect health systems against pandemic events. We will only bridge this gap by turning the need into an investment case. I believe climate action is the great growth accelerator for developing countries in the years to come, and the great source of resilience for the most vulnerable countries if we do things right. Decarbonization is not deindustrialization, rather the opposite. Decarbonization means innovation, technology, growth, development, stability and prosperity for future generations. We need to scale up the models that works today and use more ingenuity to come up with new solutions that can be scaled up quickly. Public finance and multilateral development banks have a central role to play in taking the risks that the private sector is not willing to take, and in going into sectors where the economic profitability is yet unclear, bringing to the market what we call patient capital. The Bridgetown Initiative, championed by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley and the UN Secretary General António Guterres, pushes us to urgently reform the international financial architecture to address the development needs of the global south. International financial institutions, MDBs like the European Investment Bank, must play their part. Our role is to leverage every cent our shareholders give us by crowding in private investments for projects that cut emission, improving countries' resilience, not just to climate change, but also to other crises like pandemics. Let me stress that we have to go well beyond the low-hanging fruits. We must provide robust support for innovative and truly transformative technologies to decarbonize, for example, hard-to-abate industries, such as steel and concrete. Here we really need cutting-edge solutions. We can and must confront the challenges ahead head-on and win the fight against climate change, not through the fear that can paralyze us, but through the opportunities that make our hearts beat. I know how much work can be needed to get the climate project off the ground, especially in adaptation, to make it both bankable and to make it achieve its intended impact. Listening carefully to our partners will help to meet the legitimate demand of developing countries for tools that square the circle between the resources available and the lack of technical capacity to put projects into motion, between the massive investment needs and debt sustainability, and between investments and high vulnerability to disasters. To respond to these challenges, at the EIB, we have recently agreed to extend the tenure of our sovereign loans to up to 30 years, with a grace period of up to 10 years. We have increased our global presence to better listen and share our technical expertise, and to bring to life ideas such as debt for nature swaps and debt for climate swaps, and including climate resilient clauses in our investment agreements. In Europe, I think we are waking up, but we are still too slow. We need a very strong coffee. Our collective awakening was rather traumatic on 24th of February 2022 with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Our reliance on Russian gas was also to the detriment of market incentive for shift towards renewables. It provided a bitter lesson that investing in fossil fuels is just a plain bad idea, also from a financial perspective. In 2019, at the EIB, we already decided to phase out investments in all unabated fossil fuel energy projects, including natural gas. And in 2020, we committed to dedicating at least half of all our funding to climate action and environmental sustainability by 2025, supporting 1 trillion euros of green investment by 2030. We are well on track, not just in terms of the financial volumes, but also in the impact and focus of our projects, technology-driven, supporting the green transition. We want to establish and nurture more eye-level partnerships worldwide, based on innovative climate action, on a strong commitment to adaptation, and on building investment bridges with the world. The case for climate action is stronger than ever. With these words, I wish you a successful morning and thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Thomas Östros, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Now, to fixing finance, our first session today. Taking action, as you've heard, requires money, but where is it going to come from? There are increasing calls from the very highest levels, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, to fundamentally reform the global financial architecture. But if there is reform, what should it look like? Again, that phrase, what works and what doesn't?
What a difference a war makes. President Biden started his tenure pledging to cut back on the use of fossil fuels. Did one war in Ukraine undo all those best-laid plans?
We're not asking to be treated differently. We want a fair financial system.
Now, in a moment, we'll be hearing from our first panel of the day. But first, here's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization.
Organizing this session around the Climate Week in New York could not have been more timely. This week, leaders from around the world, the whole UN system, will be meeting at the 78th session of the UN General Assembly with the aim of finding new, concrete and lasting solutions to the climate and development challenges of our time. We have only 7 years left before reaching the SDGs. This summer has been one of the hottest around the world. In the words of the UN Secretary General, the era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. So far, trade has been the big missing piece in the response to the climate crisis. Trade can drive down the cost of new technologies, allow the scaling up of their production, and facilitate dissemination across the world. An open, rules-based multilateral trading system is a necessary foundation for responding to today's global challenges. Trade policy reforms can directly help alleviate the fiscal burden of climate and development finance. Governments currently spend more than $600 billion per year on trade distorting and often environmentally damaging agricultural support. Reforming agricultural trade rules at the WTO would help repurpose some of these resources towards climate mitigation and adaptation. Reform and repurposing is exactly what we did with the recent fisheries subsidies agreement, which will contribute to freeing up around $22 billion in annual public spending on harmful fisheries subsidies. These can be redirected to help improve the sustainability of our fisheries and oceans. The Aid for Trade initiative helps developing countries, in particular least developed countries, to build the trade capacity and infrastructure they need to increase participation in and benefit from international trade. In 2020, 51% of Aid for Trade commitments made had climate-related objectives. This initiative could help mobilize additional funding by better integrating the trade dimension into countries' national adaptation strategies. 2 upcoming global events provide windows of opportunity to move in the right direction. First, the COP28 in Dubai in December. This is the first COP with a dedicated trade day, and it has the potential to deliver significant policy progress at the trade-climate interface. It's not by chance that trade and finance are brought together. We need both to build efficient and resilient global supply chains by way of investments into early warning systems and climate-resilient infrastructure. And second, the WTO ministerial meeting in Abu Dhabi in February 2024. Trade ministers will need to deliver real progress on all the fronts. We must start by ensuring that our new fisheries subsidies agreement enters into force. We must advance an agenda that recognizes the core objective of sustainable development embedded in the WTO's founding documents. The WTO stands ready to join forces with all of you. Let's work together to build this new financial and trade architecture and reinvigorate the trading system to deliver for a greener planet for people.
Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first panel. The former president of Colombia, Iván Duque Marquez, Bajolo Kenawendo, Special Advisor and Africa Director for the UN High-Level Climate Champions, Bertrand Badre, former Managing Director of the World Bank and CEO and founder of Blue, Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. And we should be joined down the line by Nancy Sage, Chief Climate Change Expert at the EIB. Welcome to all of you. Before we get going, just one quick reminder for the audience watching, especially those in New York, for Climate Week. You're going to be part of this too. So let us know what you have to say by hopping on the hashtag #PSEvents. This session is called Fixing Finance. I just want a brief thought from all of you, starting with you, Bertrand, about what isn't working at the moment.
Well, I think a lot is not working.
Okay.
I think we agreed in 2015 to a fantastic and ambitious agenda, and we promoted the idea that it would be a transition. And transition is like a benign word. You say you will have to decrease your CO2 emission by 1 to 2% per annum, and you will have to reallocate your money by 1 or 2% per annum. So it looks okay. I mean, nobody can oppose 1 or 2% move per annum. It's just like crossing the beach from point A to point B, and at the end you say after 30 years, oh, I crossed the beach, it's okay, I didn't even feel it. And here we are 8 years later. Not only we have not been able to do this minus 1, 2%, but we realized with COVID that it's a big deal. Now the hurdle is higher, and we understand it's a transformation. And the big issue is that now we have to convince people that it's serious, and it's a transformation of production, consumption, finance, and that's for me the challenge. That's why people are irritated on all sides. The NGOs say you don't do enough, and other people say you already do too much, and you're stuck between these two forces.
But events always happen. It's unpredictable. You can never tell. Bertrand said it should have been easy to do, just those few steps, and it wasn't. Do you agree that that's not what's working at the moment, or is there something else?
I agree, but I think there's a lot more. The global financial infrastructure is not working in itself. It's unfit for purpose. It hasn't readjusted to the crisis that we're dealing with at the moment, and crisis that we know we will be dealing with in the future. And then the current green financial infrastructure that is growing quite exponentially is also marred with a lot of trust deficit. Over 75% of those pledges and commitments that were made with the Paris Agreement have not been met. And we're not seeing enough financial flows to EMDE markets.
Right. I mean, Nancy, why do you think that is, picking up on what Bachola's just said?
So I wanted to build on what Bertrand said. Indeed, it seems that we think we've got more time than we have. So I think that one of the things that's actually causing a problem. I mean, there are very many efforts around the world to have better definitions of green and climate finance. And I think this kind of transparency and robustness can only help. But I do think that we have not been paying enough attention to the Paris alignment, to the alignment of all finance with the temperature and the climate resilience goals. And this, I think, somehow through the use of the term net zero by 2040, 2050, 2060, of course it depends on the country and on the sector what target has been set. This idea that that end goal is the thing that matters, when in fact it's the path that we get there that matters. In fact, if we don't get that path right, then the net zero will be too little too late, whatever year you've chosen. And so I do think that that's a thing where we really need more focus, and that's on the alignment of all the finance with the Paris goals, without which we'll be undermining all our efforts in sustainable development.
Can I get then from you, President Duque, a more country-specific perspective? When we take a country like Colombia, how much of a problem is a lack of climate financing?
So what I would say is that we have not realized that the most important obstacle is fiscal space. When you look at IMF numbers, the relation of GDP to debt is almost 95% on average in the global south, which means that even if you had the money, your fiscal space to mobilize the resources is quite limited. So then you have to think intelligently, and that's where I think the renewable of modern finance instruments have to be considered, which in my humble opinion are three. One, the debt swaps need to happen, not only exchanging what you're doing on climate action, but the resources you're liberating of the future payments of debt have to be devoted to climate investment. The second, you need an agreement with the IMF so that many of the fiscal expenses that are needed in the next decade can be considered with the special purpose vehicles as below the line in the fiscal deficit calculation. And last but not least, and we're working on that with Bogolo in Africa, with the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, you need high integrity carbon markets in order to get the massive mobilization of resources. And I'll finish by saying this, just Africa requires $2.8 trillion from now to 2030 just to achieve the NDCs. And if they don't have this combination, it's going to be very difficult to get to that number.
But you're working with Bacholo, you say, but are people listening? Are the right people listening to the sorts of suggestions and proposals that have been outlined?
I mean, certainly we have seen a real change, first of all, among African leaders in responding to the challenges of climate action, but also in positioning the continent as a solution leader and not just looking at the historical challenges, which are real. Coming out of the Africa Climate Summit, we saw a more positioning of we have solutions, we need the world to come to the table to help us work out these solutions. And we still go back to the real ambitions. We have this common future, 1.5 degree future. It's a big ambition, but it should be backed up by real ambitious finance, and not just for mitigation purposes, but for adaptation and resilience.
Bertrand, are you looking skeptical in terms of ambition versus action?
No, well, yes, but my point is the following. In 2015, I coined a word which has become, unfortunately or fortunately, famous. I said we need to move from billions to trillions. So to illustrate the change of scale. The issue is that it's still valid today. We have a little bit more billions, as you've seen on the graph, but we need more trillions. At a moment where precisely there is less, as Ivan just said, less public money available unless we are innovative, and at the moment where private money is distracted. So we need more at a moment where we have less, and we didn't do anything while the interest rates were low and when we had the capacity to do. So that's where we are hitting the wall.
Right, well, you brought up the issue that we are no longer in a so-called benign economic backdrop. Well, let me just show you, Bertrand, this quote. It's from a US Senator, Sheldon Whitehouse. It's in the current edition of Project Syndicate's premium subscriber magazine. And it's where he says the warning signs of another 2008 scale financial crisis are already flashing red across multiple economic sectors. First of all, do you agree?
It's always difficult. I mean, you have always people who say ahead of a crisis that there will be a crisis, and then they look very smart. So I can say that, and I might look smart, and if it's not happening, people will forget that I was stupid today. But my point, yes, the financial system has been to a certain extent patched up. We have increased capital requirements, etc., but we have not changed the heart of the system. So it's still working very much without taking into account the externalities, without taking into account what we are discussing today. So what we've done between 2008 and now is not really a change of the system. It's really a little bit of band-aid on the system. And so we are still fragile, as we've seen earlier this year with SVB or Credit Suisse or others.
Right. Well, President Duque, isn't that going to make things even more difficult to then achieve the sorts of goals you're setting out if we see slowing growth in China?
I can tell you from the experience of Colombia, there are 4 good lessons. I'd say one, we were able to launch the green taxonomy. That was a good way to present the markets all the set of policies that we were working on. The second thing that was very important was to be one of the first Latin American governments issuing green bonds based on the taxonomy and getting greeniums of 7% and a discount that were very interesting. Getting the first global blue bond with Conservation International to be brought to the market. And last but not least was how to work with the local governments, because that's another issue that we have never talked. And is that local governments need to have more resources for climate action. And every single time they look for a loan from a multilateral, they require a guarantee. And what happens with the central governments is the guarantees are considered as if they were loan itself, so it gets limited. I think one of the most creative things that can be undertaken is to have a global guarantee fund for subnationals for climate action investment.
Nancy, do you agree with that?
Well, I certainly think that cities are absolutely key. Whatever country you're looking at, you have in developing countries an ever-increasing urban population, and the majority of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities. Obviously, there are issues around climate-resilient agriculture and emissions from agriculture, but the emissions from cities and the solutions that we have for cities are absolutely huge, and we really have no time to waste there. So indeed, I think there's lots of things that are needed. One is obviously to provide them with a better way of accessing money, and one idea has just been laid out. But another thing is to actually help cities with their plans, with their climate plans. And for example, at the EIB, we work together with the World Bank on something called the GAP Fund. And it was set up because there is a gap, and you need to fill it, which is to help cities make plans, and that covers decarbonisation, but also adaptation and resilience plans, so that you can have a range of investable projects that investors can then perhaps invest in, or which can be financed using a guarantee, perhaps as was just mentioned.
Right. Do you think the EIB is being bold enough, Bertrand?
No.
No. Why not?
No, I think that it's not just the EIB. I think the whole multilateral system is central and, to be honest, not up to the expectations. And we all know, I mean, there have been dozens of reports written about this because it's pretty slow. It's still pretty constrained politically. It's still, I mean, there are a lot of issues which make it a very difficult animal to move. And I think we need not only to grow the scale of the efforts, but for me, the culture of this organization. They need to embrace working with the private sector, not to do just pay lip service, etc. So I think it's a broad revolution that we need in the system. We have the tools, but we need to radically transform the way public and private sector interact. Because this climate issue is not a private problem, it's not a public problem, it's a joint problem. And if we're incapable of truly joining forces and trusting each other, we not go anywhere.
We're going to come on to the detail of some of what you said in just a moment, but I want to ask you, Bukola, whether a development at the G20 recently has moved the dial in terms of engagement with the African Union. Let me just show you footage from the G20 in India. The African Union were invited in as permanent G20 members on a par with the European Union. You can see Narendra Modi there. Do you think that this is a significant shift? Is it actually going to be significant in terms of strengthening both the G20 and the African Union?
We have certainly been calling for the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 and asking the wider beyond G20 for there to be, for us to remove biases in relation to development issues and make sure that the systems are working better for developing countries. So we're hoping that with the AU being a member of the G20, we will see a stronger voice for development issues, for the just transition, for financing development and climate action in the continent. And that there will be a sort of a backup, if I may say, backup for India, for other developing markets. So South Africa hasn't been strong enough by itself in the G20. So hopefully with the AU we will see that. But what it also really needs is that the African Union must come up with a very strong position on these key issues, particularly around unlocking climate finance and driving it beyond the 11% that we've seen going to Africa in the last decade, which has been only, I think, $30 billion of a total of over $980 billion flow of climate finance. That's very insignificant, looking at the contribution of Africa to the greater climate action narrative.
What would you suggest should be their first sort of case, their argument put forward now they are part of the G20?
Well, first, let's work on SDR rechanneling. That is right at the top of it. We've been positioning the AFDB, AFC, AfrExim as very credible and strong African institutions that should be used for SDR rechanneling. And secondly, that we need to see the implementation and operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, and that we need to see a lot more concerted efforts towards energy access in the continent. There are so many others. One, nature, we tend to forget about. And I think that is a conversation that the AU should bring, given that we still have over 75% of our biodiversity still intact and offering that towards the climate solution.
President Duque, we're going to hear all sorts of suggestions across the city this week because it's Climate Week and also the United Nations General Assembly, and there'll be more, no doubt, innovative ideas to improve the flow of money. You've made some suggestions that have been carried out in Colombia, but what is stopping them? What is the obstacle to stopping so many projects becoming a reality?
Well, I think that we have, and I think in fact it's needed, we have concentrated too much on carbon neutrality as an objective, obviously, but I think we also have to put the context of nature positive in the conversation. And the reason why I mention this is when you look at the African continent and you look at the first equations of the amount of greenhouse gases, you will say Africa only represents 4% of emissions. What happens that when you add the negative use of land, you get to 10%, which is almost the level of emissions that Europe has. And Africa requires to spend 2.8 trillion in the next 8 years. So how would you accelerate that? And I think the discussion of high integrity carbon markets is crucial just because there's one simple thing. Every time we go to COPs, we see a lot of pledges on the same money that was pledged last year and the year before and the year before. Yeah. And the only way to massively mobilize capital today is to walk through this instrument. Now the question is, what is missing? I think more than the demand, because you have buyers in the markets, is the supply, which is the high quality projects that have high integrity, scrutinizable, good accounting, and that's where I think most of the development institutions' effort have to work to create those conditions, especially in the global south. Not only Africa, Latin America as well, but it's the only way that we're going to trigger that massive mobilization of capital.
Well, Nancy, you were nodding while President Duque was talking there. I want to now refer, because I think it's a good time to bring up these two figures, which show what Bertrand was talking about, the climate finance growth rate between the private investment, private sector and public investment. You can see the big difference there between 4.8% for private investment, 9.1% for public investment. Obviously a big gap between them. Is there any risk in your mind, Nancy, about the private sector contribution moving backwards?
Well, I suppose there is, but I think the other thing we have to be careful about when we look at such a graph is that that's a global figure. So already we can see we want more private investment, but if you look underneath that global figure, you will find that nearly all of that private investment is actually going to climate action in developed countries. Much less of it is going to low and middle income countries, and in that situation, very little indeed to least developed countries. The other thing that you need to dig into a bit is what's the mitigation and adaptation split? And again, although of course we do want to mobilize more private finance for adaptation, and in fact there are some very interesting innovative funds. We've funded a few of them. One is Craft, for example. But you do need to look at the fact that quite a lot of adaptation needs to be financed in a different way. So I would say there may be some concerns, and of course the green taxonomy from Colombia was mentioned. Taxonomies and robust reporting, including on greenhouse gas, is a good way of making sure that investors are confident. But I would also say that we have to look deeper into the numbers and really analyse where the gaps are and what type of funding is appropriate for what type of action. Obviously, we want more private finance wherever we can, but there will be some things that need public investment.
But what's concerning is the amount, as Nancy said, that is being spent of that private investment on developing countries or the global south as opposed to developed countries.
Yeah, for me, it's a central question. There is enough money in the north, actually, then you can discuss whether it goes fast enough and at the right place. The big issue, I was stunned, I was participating to the summit that President Macron convened in June in Paris. And one of the figures I spread, which I was kind of aware but did not really dig into that, is that if you consider the European assets under management, you have only 4% that goes to emerging market, broadly speaking. So can you imagine the sub-part that goes to climate and the sub-part that goes to the countries we are discussing? In the US, it's even worse. It's closer to 2%. So, and it's diminishing. That's the problem. There are reasons why it's diminishing and why you have pressure. First, interest rates are rising. And so if you're a pension fund in the US or mutual insurance in France, you buy treasuries. It's easier than to invest in a solar farm in Morocco or in Colombia. Second, you have the IRA and the Green Deal. So if you're, again, an institutional investor in Europe or America, you put your money where the risk and the money is what you know. And third, which is for me the most worrying part, I believe this is a price we pay after several years. There is a shrinking of the horizon of people. The reality, I've heard that because I'm raising money, there is a reality that people say there is enough problem at home. Why would my money help Africans or Latin Americans? I've heard people who tell me my clients don't want their money to be used away from home.
Right, well that's
which is a big issue. Actually.
Well, that is quite candid, I would say. Bruno, what would you say in response? How would you convince people to do the opposite?
You know, it's very interesting because I've heard this argument before of why should we even think about developing markets. And yet we are saying to developing markets that have not been a part of this problem, that haven't contributed to raise ambition and be part of the solution. So if you don't think that your capital should flow to developing markets, then there shouldn't be an expectation for developing markets to come to the table for climate action. But that is not solving the problem. Then we're just pointing fingers. So I think at first what we need to see is a strong commitment from DFIs, MDBs to originate, to distribute, to crowd in the private sector, work on models that will allow for the private sector to want to engage in EMD models, markets. And then there's this perceived risk. You know, there's real risk, but there's also perception of risk that I think we have to deal with when it comes to investing in Africa and other developing markets. And so we need to use, I think there's an opportunity to use some AU institutions in Africa, like Afrexim, AFDB, and others that have really financed projects in the continent to show that the risk is not that much. And for us to really work on a risk-sharing data platform to comfort some of the investors.
I mean, might it be different now? Are we seeing the beginnings, President Duque, of a global realignment, the sort of thing that you're suggesting with Colombia and perhaps other similar countries? People talk about the decline of the West, maybe the emergence of middle economies. Is that global realignment happening?
Well, I think we talk about climate and nature on a regular basis, but the fact is the superpowers of biodiversity are in the global south. Right. So if we were to think on the world's superpowers that are going to be crucial for nature positive solutions, they're all in the global south. But the thing is, what's the value of conservation? You have the Amazon basin that's almost the size of Australia or the United States without Alaska. It has 40% of the world's biodiversity, and just the Amazon River discharges in an hour what people consume, 7 billion people consume in a year. So it's an ecosystem that has to be protected, and without that ecosystem, there's going to be no solutions. So the question is, why to invest in the Amazon just from a pure investment perspective? Well, you're going to be investing in a region where the emissions per point of GDP are much lower than many of the global north markets. And if you make the argument and you find the projects and you have the credibility, the verification categories, and also the scrutinizable evaluation of the projects over time, you'll see it's a good way of doing good by doing well. And I think that's where we have to mobilize the resources. And let me finish with this, Johan. We talk about the MDBs. I gave 14 years of my career in the MDBs. But you know what's the problem? The replenishments of capital are taking too long, and the banks are getting shorter and shorter on their capital response to the needs of the countries, and that's why the countries are more reliable today on global markets than just waiting for the development finance to occur.
Well, we're going to take questions from journalists in a few minutes' time, but before we do, I just want to play you this clip, and Bertrand, get you to respond since you mentioned the Global Financing Pact, the summit that took place. Let's hear from the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz.
There is a debate about the international financial architecture, and my view is that really we have to do something to work on the questions of reforms of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. We need a change to have more money that could be used with just changing the way how these banks are managed and the framework for their activities. And if we do this very fast, this will have a very concrete outcome for many people.
That was Olaf Scholz. What was going on behind the scenes in Paris, Bertrand? Can you give us an insight into the sorts of conversations that were going on?
No, but I think Paris, there are many merits to this conference, but the main merit is to have put the questions on the table. And so, I mean, again, we don't have all the answers, but we understand that there is a gap that we've described between the so-called global south and the north, that we have this financial gap, that we have an issue between public and private money. All of this is well identified. And we also have the issue of the reform of the multilaterals, which has been moving a little bit forward at the G20. The big issue, I mean, there are many big issues with the multilaterals. On the one hand, to move, as I said, from the billions to the trillions, to increase the firepower of these institutions, because there is a big leverage. But the second issue is the one that Chancellor Scholz mentioned. You also have a cultural issues within these institutions. How do you move, once you get to the trillions, how do you move to the millions that are needed? How do you spread the things? How do you deliver? How do you convey the money? And that's where we are not there yet.
Well, Nancy, perhaps you'd like to respond.
Well, certainly, of course, there's lots of calls for the MDBs to look into how they're structured and for their shareholders to do that. And of course, EIB, like the other MDBs, is looking at that extremely seriously. And we had a lot of details in the G20 Leaders Summit. But I would like to say that, as well as that, there's a lot more that the MDBs can do together. And we are trying to step up, particularly better cooperation on how we support countries and other clients in their long-term strategies, not just the NDCs, but sort of longer-term strategies, cooperating not just better amongst ourselves, but also with other entities. And we're also looking at how we can actually bring together our joint efforts to have donor funds, which would also help with developing these plans. And that would be obviously for all different kinds of countries, but also cities and perhaps national authorities. Another thing that we are trying to do a lot more on is just transition. And another thing which I might mention is we've just published in June methodology for Paris alignment of new operations. So although, of course, the restructuring discussion is very important, and we can always do better. In fact, all of us need to do better because there's a long way to go in a short space of time. But just to say, the MDBs are working on quite a lot of things together very closely, the climate teams and the biodiversity teams, to try and deliver more for clients and actually get things accelerated.
Well, I suppose the overarching question is how people here and around the world hold yours and other institutions' feet to the fire, but perhaps that's for another day. President Duque, I'm aware you need to go. Perhaps a warm round of applause because he is leaving. You can leave whenever you need to. Very nice to have you here. It's time to hear from some of the journalists, and we're going to hear first of all from Rachel Koenig-Beals, who is Assistant Managing Editor and Lead Climate Writer at Market Watch. Here's Rachel's question.
Looking ahead to a big US election in 24, when it comes to fighting climate change, should the global economy be more or less integrated?
Baholo, can I get you to take that on?
Yes, I'm laughing because I know it will not be. It will not be. The focus will be more domestic, and there'll be more focus on how the climate policies affecting the domestic economy and the cost of living crisis. So there are certainly a lot of domestic issues to deal with. So I think, unfortunately, global response will not be part of the main concern, but it should be. It should be because, again, we're working towards a common future, and everyone must work on their ambitions and be more responsive to these issues.
It's going to be very difficult, though, isn't it, to persuade countries, as you say, with a cost of living crisis, when actually there are many countries, particularly in the developed world, who are actually going to perhaps extend their reliance to some extent on fossil fuels to get over that transition because of the cost.
Right.
I mean, that must disappoint you, to put it mildly.
Certainly it does, but I think that there's still an opportunity for us to deal with this particular issue because climate policy, even if they are domestic, they do have international trade repercussions, and that has a ripple effect in the cost of living. If we do not deal with them adequately, and we're not looking at how the climate policy in the US or in the EU is affecting production in Africa or in Southeast Asia, we forget that it comes back in the form of cost and higher pricing, and therefore affects cost of living. And I think we should care about these issues, and they should be part of the national debate in the lead up to the elections.
Thank you. Let's take a question here from the audience, from Kasia at the FT. Kasia, your question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, guys. So I wanted to pick up on what we were talking about at the very end of the session. So I want to talk about geopolitics. And we're seeing to a large extent, these kind of parallel tracks that are coming up. I think that was really obvious at both the G20 and the BRICS summit that we had earlier this year, these parallel tracks in terms of financing. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think these parallel tracks are potentially beneficial for financing, tackling climate change or climate disasters? And to what extent are these parallel tracks potentially worrisome?
Bertrand?
Well, I think they are more worrisome than reassuring, and that's a big issue. I remember in 2015, like many, I was relieved when President Barack Obama and President Xi Jinping shook hands, and we say, yes, we're going to make it because these two big guys are moving together. And I think we misread this moment. It was not the beginning of a new era, it was the end of history. And now we moved into everything that happened since, the wars, the parallel tracks, etc. And the solution to everything we are discussing is together public and private and civil society, together North and South, together countries. And the big issue is that there are centrifugal forces everywhere. And that's why it's very difficult to stay basically focused and optimistic, because you feel all of this. And you cannot ignore it. In particular, when you, like me, you're working, trying to raise money to invest in emerging market, of course, an investor say, why should I do that? Because it's so risky, etc. It's not just the sheer difference in rating, etc. It's all this. Whereas you can invest in a gigafactories in Wisconsin, which is pretty straightforward. So why should I go to Colombia or elsewhere?
Yeah.
So that's really, for me, what is worrisome. And we have to defeat these centrifugal forces. And to be honest, I don't know the key to that.
Well, what do you think,
I think the parallel tracks are a reflection of the trust deficit.
Yeah.
The global north, as has been positioned, has failed to honor the pledges that have been made. And so you're seeing that reflection by others trying to make an alternative. You know, it's the same even in the trade space. I was in trade for quite a bit, and you know, we've seen the failure of the multilateral system commitments, and so people are making alternatives. There was this big issue of China versus US in Africa, China versus EU in Africa, and the real reason that is the case, or that China is seen as a threat in Africa, is because it's accelerating faster in its investments in the continent, and Africans are leaning towards investments from China because they seem to be responding to the ambitions and the needs of the continent, vis-a-vis the slower investment that we have been seeing coming out of the US. And this is why Prosper Africa was important to come up, but it hasn't risen to the occasion and met FOCAC where it is, unfortunately. And this is just a reflection of where we are.
Kasia, thank you very much for your question. Final question, Nancy, I will get you to respond. It's from Olukayode Oyeleye, consulting editor at Business AM Nigeria. His question is about carbon taxes.
To what extent is the idea likely to help the Global South in avoiding a future of unequal burden on the consequences of emission not generated by them?
Nancy.
Well, I think that's a very, very important question. I think when we're thinking about African countries as well, we have to think about the issues of their businesses being in the supply chain and making sure that they have those opportunities. So the carbon tax and the border carbon tax is going to be very important. But I also think that when we think about the carbon tax and carbon markets, we have to think about those that have not emitted, and how can we use that carbon market to incentivize the way forward, where with a number of countries that have huge amounts of carbon sinks. And actually what you're trying to do is not incentivize decarbonization, but incentivize a track of development that involves protecting those carbon sinks and enhancing them. And so I think that the carbon tax discussion has to cover both those aspects. The aspect of the emitting, where people should, of course, be paying tax, there should be taxes, but also making sure that we're actually making a system which at the same time incentivizes the protection by countries that have not emitted very much at all, the protection of those natural carbon sinks.
Bukholo?
So this was actually a really big debate at ACS, and one of the questions is the carbon tax, does it then apply to developing markets that are producing fossil fuels? For example, Botswana is a coal mining country, and the big issue is how do you transition from coal if investments are not flowing to the green industries. At the moment, there's 9 times more investments into dirtier industries than to green industries in the continent. So it's a challenge to tell a country like Botswana to transition, to be taxed for being able to provide electricity to only 82% of its population. So it goes back to that question during the summit of should climate action be at the detriment of development, or how do we meet these two issues together?
I'll let that question hang. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in terms of questions from journalists. I'd just like to thank all our guests, President Duque, who's left, obviously to Nancy Sage, Bertrand Badre and Bukholo Kenewendo. Thank you very much. A big round of applause. To wrap up this session, we have Laurence Toubiana, CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you. It was a fascinating discussion. And in a way, I can absolutely share the mistrust you described and the anxieties that Bertrand described as well. At the same time, and that was evident in the Paris summit, but even more evident in the Nairobi African Climate Summit, which was for me a big, big, big event, maybe the biggest one we have and we may have seen this year. Because at that moment now, and it was very, very evident in the COP last year in Sharm, that the first time we put the climate finance architecture, meaning the global international finance architecture, at the core of the problem. And you know that's how many years we are discussing this reform, maybe 20. So at least now it's really a need to do that, even if, again, we are late in providing the 100 billion we promised in 2009, 10 exactly, and we need 2.4 trillion for developing countries between 2023 and 2030. So, and where we are is just an abysmal of difference because we have 51 billion climate finance to low-income countries and middle-income countries altogether. So we are not there. So we have to do in quantity and in quality of climate finance. But at the same time, for the first moment, there is a consensus from Ngozi or António Guterres and head of states that says the system doesn't work, which is really, tell me, I'm now 30 years working in climate, and I think that's the first time I hear that. I think we can really recognize that the V20 Accra Marrakesh agenda and the Bridgetown initiative has really, and this is the capital adequacy framework report, all outlines the priority areas to ensure a more fit for climate system, finance architecture. And it's very interesting to see African Union being now part of the G20, hopefully, and then the V20 asking for a seat at IMF. So, you know, the system is shaken and is very, very good. This is happening. So I do think that MDBs and world leaders, especially of course the G7, need to show greater political leadership and accelerate their efforts to implement those recommendations because they are there. More or less everybody agree. We have unlocked the SDR issue, you refer, Madam, earlier on, which is very, again, important resource potential. But of course now the owners, the capital owners, the lenders of the World Bank and others has to really be behind this reform. The World Bank has already embarked on this CAF journey through the evolution roadmap, but it must go much further, notably through reducing more its equity to loan ratio. And you know, this obsession of the AAA, come on, I was some years ago the president of the board of the French Agency of Development, which the loan to equity ratio is 17%. So just very different from the World Bank seems safe. And why is this AAA still? It's because there is a French state which is backing that. So what do we hope for? It's just like all the lenders of the World Bank say, you can go there because that you need, because the number between public finance and private finance are abysmal. It's just impossible when you see what we needed. So I think it must be followed by all MDBs. New G20 CAF implementation is really welcome. So, but on the other side, we see that the MDBs cannot achieve everything. We need the collaboration with domestic capital, with public development banks. And their advantage, they are working at local levels, they know what can be done. And in a way, even on the tax discussion we had, I will come back to that in a minute, this tax is for domestic use, and that the transfer of international taxation on, for example, on carbon market or carbon tax has to come back to developing countries. So the benefit of the tax should stay in the countries, and then the developed countries and the global activities has to finance what has happened at the developing country level. I do think that we have to free more financing is good, but I think we have to keep really the pressure on Paris alignment. There is a lot of talk, not so much really efficient alignment. And again, I was happy to hear, of course, EIB again, seeing that it is possible to be Paris aligned and to have a good business model and to lead multilateral development banks who are really lagging behind still. So I think this MDB reform is important. We have new resources needed. The rechanneling of SDRs to MDBs and eventually the public development banks is essential. We need that. And we have to make the African Development Bank proposal work. I do think that international taxation for climate action is necessary because the fiscal space of even the G7 countries will not make it. So and each of the options we have been discussing, and certainly at the African Climate Summit and hopefully beyond that, we see that we can ensure more equity in our financial system. Every country would pay, as President Ruto called, but developing countries would benefit twice from their domestic resource mobilization and the contribution from developed countries. So that's very important that there is a some transfer. Initially, I know that it's not popular now for the carbon border adjustment, that the revenue of this tax go back to developing countries to help them transition, but we have to come there. So I think we launch a process. I think it's very good that, again, I was struck by discussion at the African summits, Africa wanting to be on the supply chain ladder of the green industry. And that's where EU, for example, or US should invest into that transformation of the green industry. Africa, for example, define its own norms in terms of mining, in terms of the way the supply chain has to be localized. And I think that will change really deeply because of the green transition, the capacity of Africa to be on the leading role. And I was really, again, so happy to see that. I must say, it gave me hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurence Toubiana. We're going to have a short break of about 30 minutes. Can I ask that you are all back here at about 11:25, but please do go outside. Thank you again to our guests. No, yes, you can stay. You could. Oh, 10, yes, not 11. My clock's probably still on old time. Thank you for the correction. So don't go away.
They used to be once-in-a-century events, but as climate change worsens, we're seeing them every year. Stronger storms, floods, wildfires, and endless droughts. These events can cause lasting harm. Homes damaged in floods may take years to rebuild. Farmers who lose crop after crop have to find another way of life. Their communities have to find another source of food. How do we deal with the climate-fueled disasters here now? It's not hopeless. We can do more than just react to disasters when they happen. We can protect and strengthen our communities. So what are the solutions? Look around. Nature has been perfecting many of them for millions of years. The roots of healthy forests act as underground shields against landslides, storing water that would erode slopes and threaten lives. Just 1 acre of wetlands can hold 1 million gallons of water, acting like a giant sponge to prevent floods. And on coasts, a healthy coral reef can absorb 97% of a wave's force before it hits shore, making us safer when storms hit. Climate change doesn't affect us all the same way, though. Many of the people hit hardest have the fewest resources to adapt. That's why we have to work together to develop solutions that make our communities more resilient. Whether that's helping farmers prepare for more unpredictable seasons, or protecting coral reefs so they continue to guard our coasts. And when we partner with nature, our lives improve in even more ways. Restoring habitat returns important nutrients to our soils, creates nurseries for fish to grow, and cleans our air and water. And nature isn't just helping us adapt to climate change now, it also keeps carbon out of the atmosphere, helping limit future warming. That's crucial, because when it comes to protecting our communities from climate change, every degree counts, and so does every action, for today and for tomorrow.
Northern Jordan, a dry landscape with densely populated areas and an urgent demand for water.
الحمام نفس الشيء يعني الواحد بيتحمم بيجي تعبان بيجي ما فيش مي.
بشتغل سايق تنك مي وبدي مي للناس المقطوعة فالأغلب المناطق هي كلها مقطوعة.
A treatment plant and a network of pipelines financed by the European Investment Bank will supply the needs of 1.6 million people. Water is a primary resource for human life, but is becoming a rare commodity. At least 2 billion people around the world rely on contaminated drinking water sources, and things are getting worse. Population growth and climate change are limiting access to clean water, threatening peace and risking social and economic progress, especially in developing countries. In Lake Victoria, we are supporting a new water management system that provides sanitation services for 250,000 residents.
Umuhimu wa maji safi. Choo kitakuwa kisafi, tapata maji ya kutosha kufanya shughuli zangu.
Kabla ya mradi maji yalikopo ni machafu. Ni machafu, hatuwezi kucheza wala kusogea kwa maana tukisogea hata tukichezea madhara yake tutauma ugonjwa.
Severe pathogens pollute 1/3 of all rivers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But in this village in Cambodia, people can finally enjoy a glass of fresh and clean drinking water.
Cái lon máu phải tật băng tật ấy về mình mê ruột.
With 79 billion euros, the European Investment Bank supports projects that help people access safe water, prevent diseases, protect communities from droughts and floods, and preserve the environment. Because water is essential, we work to make it accessible to everybody.
Tous les jours, je me pose toujours la même question. Est-ce que j'ai été utile? Est-ce que j'ai été efficace? Et je ressens un épanouissement quand je réalise que j'ai pu rendre service, que j'ai pu sauver des vies. Najat Hafedi, je suis médecin spécialiste en anesthésie-réanimation depuis une vingtaine d'années et affectée au CHP Moulay Abdallah de Salé depuis une dizaine d'années.
Dr Romari Abdelmounaim, je suis médecin biologiste. J'ai rejoint l'ancien hôpital Moulay Abdallah de Salé en 2014 et bien sûr on a assisté au déménagement en 2017 vers cette nouvelle structure de l'hôpital.
L'hôpital Prince Moulay Abdallah est construit dans le cadre du partenariat avec l'Union européenne par le biais du financement de la BEI. Cet hôpital contient 250 lits, il contient un plateau technique moderne.
C'est un projet important qui aujourd'hui permet donc une certaine complémentarité avec la carte sanitaire. 16 hôpitaux ont été concernés par ce projet d'envergure.
Cet hôpital a vraiment changé énormément notre façon de travailler. Le laboratoire a bénéficié de cette technologie avec cette nouvelle structure et ces nouveaux équipements.
On a une grande activité au niveau de la maternité. Au niveau des urgences, on reçoit beaucoup les polytraumatisés, les accidents de la voie publique. On reçoit des malades chroniques aussi. On voit un peu de tout.
On est très content de travailler dans cette structure qui vaut à beaucoup de structures privées. C'est une fierté pour la ville de Salé.
Cet hôpital a été choisi comme un centre de référence régional pour prendre en charge les malades de la Covid. Presque 50 000. Ils ont bien traité dans les meilleures conditions.
On a au niveau des services l'arrivée des fluides un peu partout, ce qui nous permet de mettre un maximum de malades sous oxygène.
On a vraiment vécu de moments difficiles. N'empêche qu'on peut voir le côté positif de cette pandémie. Il y avait une solidarité entre nous, entre personnel. Entre tous les Marocains, il y a eu de la solidarité.
C'est plusieurs sentiments à la fois, mais en même temps, on ressent toujours ce besoin-là de se sentir en famille, d'être avec ses enfants.
Le secteur de la santé aujourd'hui au Maroc, il est sous-financé, mais avec le financement et le peu de financement que nous avons, avec également l'appui de nos partenaires, notamment la BEI, on arrive donc à surmonter ce défi. C'est un partenariat fructueux qui a permis d'améliorer le cadre de vie et donner accès donc, aux soins de santé à nos citoyens.
Grâce à ce projet, au partenariat avec l'Union européenne et à l'appui aussi de la Banque européenne d'investissement. L'installation de cet hôpital a permis l'amélioration de l'offre de soins hospitalière régionale, ce qui a permis l'augmentation de la productivité de l'offre hospitalière au niveau préfectoral et régional.
Je tiens à remercier énormément ces deux organismes d'avoir collaboré, investi dans ce projet et on est fiers d'avoir ces structures qui va nous permettre de rendre service à cette population dans les meilleures conditions.
We are defined by the environments that we live in. It's our life. The ocean is our life.
Miren hacia el mar y se miren las personas, porque si no hay recursos, no hay vida.
The big fish are gone. They have been fished out.
As a global community, we need to decide what's the value of the ocean.
There's a lot going on to raise awareness of these big oceanic problems. But the real trick is, what can we do about it?
Conservation needs to be based on a sound understanding of how these ecosystems work, whether it's traditional knowledge or contemporary science.
These remote camera systems give us a complete picture of the life in the waters.
Y si unimos, podemos hacer tal potencia que no la va a poder derribar nadie.
I will work to declare Palau's waters closed to commercial fishing.
To commit 40% of our exclusive economic zone.
Y se constituyen un líder mundial en la conservación marina.
We have an obligation as caretakers for the ocean.
En los últimos años hemos avanzado como nunca en conservación marina. Falta muchísimo por proteger y tenemos que redoblar sus esfuerzos.
We have to ensure we help preserve our environment.
Seeing the planet as it used to be, see the ocean as it should be, and trying to bring it back.
This Project Syndicate conference today with some great speakers.
We're coming together to discuss a topic no less important than the future of life on Earth.
We've just entered what is the decisive decade.
This is about saving the conditions that have allowed the human race to survive.
The world's green recovery from the pandemic is the centre of a virtual conference which will feature speakers from across the world.
Leaders need to listen. The choice is a radical change today or disaster tomorrow.
So the question is, are we ready to change?
They used to be once-in-a-century events, but as climate change worsens, we're seeing them every year. Stronger storms, floods, wildfires, and endless droughts. These events can cause lasting harm. Homes damaged in floods may take years to rebuild. Farmers who lose crop after crop have to find another way of life. Their communities have to find another source of food. How do we deal with the climate-fueled disasters here now? It's not hopeless. We can do more than just react to disasters when they happen. We can protect and strengthen our communities. So what are the solutions? Look around. Nature has been perfecting many of them for millions of years. The roots of healthy forests act as underground shields against landslides, storing water that would erode slopes and threaten lives. Just 1 acre of wetlands can hold 1 million gallons of water, acting like a giant sponge to prevent floods. And on coasts, a healthy coral reef can absorb 97% of a wave's force before it hits shore, making us safer when storms hit. Climate change doesn't affect us all the same way, though. Many of the people hit hardest have the fewest resources to adapt. That's why we have to work together to develop solutions that make our communities more resilient. Whether that's helping farmers prepare for more unpredictable seasons, or protecting coral reefs so they continue to guard our coasts. And when we partner with nature, our lives improve in even more ways. Restoring habitat returns important nutrients to our soils, creates nurseries for fish to grow, and cleans our air and water. And nature isn't just helping us adapt to climate change now. It also keeps carbon out of the atmosphere, helping limit future warming. That's crucial, because when it comes to protecting our communities from climate change, every degree counts, and so does every action, for today and for tomorrow.
Northern Jordan, a dry landscape with densely populated areas and an urgent demand for water.
الحمام نفس الشيء يعني الواحد بيتحمم بيجي تعبان بيجي ما فيش مي.
بشتغل سايق تنك مي وبجيب مي للناس المقطوعة، فالأغلب المناطق هي كلياتها مقطوعة.
A treatment plant and a network of pipelines, financed by the European Investment Bank, will supply the needs of 1.6 million people. Water is a primary resource for human life, but is becoming a rare commodity. At least 2 billion people around the world rely on contaminated drinking water sources, and things are getting worse. Population growth and climate change are limiting access to clean water, threatening peace and risking social and economic progress, especially in developing countries. In Lake Victoria, we are supporting a new water management system that provides sanitation services for 250,000 residents.
Umuhimu wa maji safi. Choo kitakuwa kisafi, tutapata maji ya kutosha kufanya shughuli zangu.
Kabla ya mradi maji yalikopo ni machafu. Ni machafu, hatuwezi kucheza wala kusogea kwa maana tukisogea hata tukichezea madhara yake tutauma ugonjwa.
Severe pathogens pollute 1/3 of all rivers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But in this village in Cambodia, people can finally enjoy a glass of fresh and clean drinking water.
Cái lon máu phải tật bằng tật ấy về mình mê ruột.
With 79 billion euros, the European Investment Bank supports projects that help people access safe water, prevent diseases, protect communities from droughts and floods, and preserve the environment. Because water is essential, we work to make it accessible to everybody.
Tous les jours, je me pose toujours la même question. Est-ce que j'ai été utile? Est-ce que j'ai été efficace? Et je ressens un épanouissement quand je réalise que j'ai pu rendre service, que j'ai pu sauver des vies. Najat Hafedi, je suis médecin spécialiste en anesthésie-réanimation depuis une vingtaine d'années et affectée au CHP Moulay Abdallah de Salé depuis une dizaine d'années.
Dr Romari Abdelmounem, je suis médecin biologiste. J'ai rejoint l'ancien hôpital Moulay Abdallah de Salé en 2014 et bien sûr on a assisté au déménagement en 2017 vers cette nouvelle structure de l'hôpital.
L'hôpital Prince Moulay Abdallah est construit dans le cadre du partenariat avec l'Union européenne par le biais de financement de la BEI. Cet hôpital contient 250 lits, il contient un plateau technique moderne.
C'est un projet important qui aujourd'hui permet donc une certaine complémentarité avec la carte sanitaire. 16 hôpitaux ont été concernés par ce projet d'envergure.
Cet hôpital a vraiment changé énormément notre façon de travailler. Le laboratoire a bénéficié de cette technologie avec cette nouvelle structure et ces nouveaux équipements.
On a une grande activité au niveau de la maternité. Au niveau des urgences, on reçoit beaucoup les polytraumatisés, les accidents de la voie publique. On reçoit des malades chroniques aussi. On voit un peu de tout.
On est très content de travailler dans cette structure qui vaut à beaucoup de structures privées. C'est une fierté pour la ville de Salé.
Cet hôpital a été choisi comme un centre de référence régional pour prendre en charge les malades de la Covid. Presque 50 000, ils ont bien traité dans les meilleures conditions.
On a au niveau des services l'arrivée des fluides un peu partout, ce qui nous permet de mettre un maximum de malades sous oxygène.
On a vraiment vécu de moments difficiles. N'empêche qu'on peut voir le côté positif de cette pandémie. Il y avait une solidarité entre nous, entre personnel. Entre tous les Marocains, il y a eu de la solidarité.
C'est plusieurs sentiments à la fois, mais en même temps, on ressent toujours ce besoin-là de se sentir en famille, d'être avec ses enfants.
Le secteur de la santé aujourd'hui au Maroc, il est sous-financé, mais avec le financement et le peu de financement que nous avons, avec également l'appui de nos partenaires, notamment la BEI, on arrive donc à surmonter ce défi. C'est un partenariat fructueux qui a permis d'améliorer le cadre de vie et donner accès donc, aux soins de santé à nos citoyens.
Hello, welcome back to Climate and Development Finance. What works? Brought to you by Project Syndicate and the European Investment Bank. I'm Jo Coburn. Few projects in human history can have been as ambitious as the Sustainable Development Goals. 7 years ago, the leaders of all but a handful of countries pledged that by 2030, humanity would end poverty, hunger, all forms of discrimination against women and girls, ensure universal schooling, and no less than 165 other targets for similar bold ambition. But it's the halfway point, and this week in New York at the United Nations General Assembly, a stocktake of the progress is being made, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of it.
At the current rate, it will take 286 years.
The global financial architecture does not need a simple evolution. It needs a radical transformation. It is time for a new Bretton Woods moment.
Well, don't despair quite yet. Over the next 50 minutes, we'll be hearing why there is still hope and exploring the practical steps that might still get us there. Crucially, we'll be looking at the money, how best to spend the billions available in development funding. Again, what works and what doesn't. So to open this session, who better to hear from than Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme.
We must now turn up the heat on a new form of development through decarbonization. In many ways, we know what to do. The question is, how can we support the shifts needed on the ground? First, climate must be the foundation for this new development model that works for people and planet. That is amongst the aims of the United Nations Development Programme's Climate Promise Initiative. It is currently supporting over 120 countries to develop and implement their nationally determined contributions as sovereign investment plans for a green future. Through this assistance, Uzbekistan has been prompted to make strategic new investments in clean, affordable energies. Or Cambodia has unlocked brand new sources of climate finance. And indeed, consider Ecuador, which is the first country in Latin America to incorporate a gendered approach to climate finance that is now mandatory for all public entities. Even amidst war, Ukraine is also advancing a green future. For instance, alongside the government, the European Investment Bank and UNDP are helping to rebuild public infrastructure that has been damaged or destroyed in the war. In their place, we are helping to construct green, energy-efficient schools and health centers towards a more climate-resilient future with increased energy security at its core. Second, unlocking climate finance at scale requires economy-wide, country-led approaches. With partners including the European Union, the United Nations is working alongside over 80 countries to implement integrated national financing frameworks, or INFFs. These are helping to generate a brand new set of sources of public and private finance towards the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. To take just one example, that includes Nigeria, which is using its INFF to diversify away from fossil fuels. These INFFs can also be the foundation for countries to drive innovation in the financial sphere, including green bonds. Developing countries are looking to partners like the European Investment Bank, especially given its recent issuance of the first ever digital climate awareness bond built on blockchain technology. Third, with some financial institutions still wary of making the level of investment needed, there is a crucial need to de-risk climate investments with a focus on renewable energies that will power our global green economy of the future. This de-risking approach is embedded in the Africa Mini-Grids program led by UNDP. This is a $65 billion investment opportunity to connect 265 million people to clean and affordable electricity. Projects in countries such as Burkina Faso and Somalia have already kicked off and can be scaled up even further. As humanity faces the existential threat of climate change, the world is more united than ever in understanding the problem, but less able to act in unison. Yet, the recent Africa Climate Summit, hosted in Nairobi, Kenya, was another indicator of the growing collective will to confront this defining challenge of our times. Indeed, consider countries like Mozambique and Kenya that already source over 90% of their electricity from green and renewable resources. As the 78th United Nations General Assembly convenes in New York, world leaders must cease to assume that some of the world's lowest income countries that are mired in debt and in the midst of a fiscal crisis should now borrow even more. With reform of the international financial architecture of the utmost priority, high-income countries must also extend critical finance, debt relief and adaptation support to drive climate action, decarbonization and clean energies as true co-investments in our collective future.
Achim Steiner there, the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. Now, before we get started with our second panel of the day, a reminder that we want as many perspectives on all of this as possible. That means you, both the audience here, at home and in the room. So please hop on the hashtag PS Events and get your voice heard. Now, to our panel, who I am delighted to be able to introduce. First of all, sitting here next to me, Annie Dasgupta, President and CEO of the World Resources Institute, Catherine Hayhoe, who is the Chief Scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and Vera Songwe, Chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and Co-Chair of the High-Level Panel on Climate Finance. Joining us remotely, I hope, is Ayla Cravey, Chief Sustainable Finance Advisor at the European Investment Bank. Welcome to all of you. Let's give them a round of applause to encourage them. Can I start by asking for a brief response to a general question, which is the sort of common criticism of the Sustainable Development Goals? Were they, Annie, just too ambitious? Was it always going to be impossible?
Were they too ambitious, or you could say were they ambitious, not ambitious enough? It's a political commitment to get to the world to a place that actually we can thrive, our children can thrive, nature can thrive. And I don't think the question is whether it's ambitious enough. The question is, why aren't we getting there fast enough? And I must point to, and you will hear a lot this week, we're not getting there, this is happening, you saw the numbers there. I just want to comment I would like to make is what we have learned about these commitments is how interconnected they are. I mean, the science of the commitments are made, if you can look at my pin, there were all these silos, 17 silos of things we need to achieve. But what we have learned over the years about how to do them is how interconnected those outcomes are. So you'll hear a lot how climate outcomes and development outcomes or agricultural outcomes, water outcomes, these are not. So what my only thing would be to say how to get there in the next 6 years and 3 months is to focus.
But is it damaging, Catherine, if you don't achieve them in the timescale that's been set out? Does that damage then further ambition in terms of achieving the goals, laudable as they sounded at the time? Or do you agree with what Annie said, but perhaps they weren't ambitious enough?
Well, what we know is that everything we do matters. And as a climate scientist in the field of climate change, I know that whether or not we reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, every bit of warming we avoid makes a difference. Similarly, every step of progress we make to address an SDG, it makes a real difference in people's lives. How do we humans accomplish something without setting a goal? That's the first step, is to set that goal. Do everything we can to meet it. And in doing so, we will be better off. But yes, we need more.
Vera, were they the right goals?
I think the goals were more than ambitious and the right goals, by the way, because remember that at the time when the goals were set, we had seen countries deliver on the SDGs in a 15-year period. China, for example, 300 million people out of poverty, cleaning the environment. So we knew we could do it if you pulled together these things. But what we needed was leadership. We had leadership at the time to set the goals. The question is, do we have leadership today to realize and succeed on the goals? And if we look at, you know, the space that I work in, which is finance, if you just put together all the subsidies that we are spending in the different industries, turn that around to solve the climate problem, and we will be there and even better.
Taking on that leadership question, Ayla, is that the problem? Is that why so many of them have been missed, these goals?
So I think, first of all, yes, the goals were ambitious, but not too ambitious in my opinion. And this is certainly the fact that we have not been performing very well. Is no excuse not to continue trying to achieve them. But first of all, I think we should stop financing and encouraging through subsidies or visible investments in projects which work against them. For example, fossil fuel. Why do we still go for fossil fuel new investments when we are trying to reduce the carbon emission? That makes absolutely zero sense. And also, what I would like to see more with the SDGs, that it's not just a goal; it also puts impact on the map. So it's not just that we want to achieve a sustainable climate. What does it mean? How many carbon emissions must be reduced? That I think is a bit more helpful than having a very sort of broad societal goal, to put it down in terms of numbers, in terms of objective, and focus on the impact of the investments and projects that we are financing.
Right, I mean, Annie, do you think that a lot of the climate and development finance is being spent in the wrong way?
No, there's not enough development and climate finance. Vera just talked about subsidies, for example. There's $4 trillion of subsidies in the world today. And the gap that all of us have been talking about is much less than that. So it is, I don't think it's been spent the wrong way. I do think that what we have learned is that rather than go for goals, is to focus on the root cause and the systems that need to be changed. For example, take agriculture, for example. The 1 billion people in the world that are malnutrition, has malnutrition right now, and 1/3 of food is wasted. And it actually uses more water and pollutes water system to use agriculture. If you just take that system, that has 50% of world's employment, you change that system together, that's where the leadership is needed, how to do it. Not leadership on goals, but how do we actually get it, and take a systems approach to it and focus. What I feel what's not happening is we are doing 1,000 things everywhere. With the limited money we have, if we focus on changing things, then we will meet multiple goals at the same time. And that is the leadership we need right now.
Catherine?
We don't have enough time, we don't have enough money to individually work on and meet each goal. So rather than beginning with the goal and then trying to design individual projects for each goal, begin with something that has win-win-wins. So you just mentioned the fact that we waste food and people are going hungry every day. Food waste produces so much heat-trapping gases, it would be the 4th largest country in the world, food waste emissions alone. So it also is a climate solution at the same time. We need these win-win-win solutions, and there are many of them out there, from the micro scale of greening urban areas to the macro scale of climate finance, like with nature bonds or blue bonds. There are win-wins at every scale, and that's what we need to be investing in.
Well, let's just pick an example. I want to show all of you, but Ayla, I would like you to respond to it. I want to show you this graph. It shows a decade of data on climate mitigation finance. And you can see very clearly renewable energy investment is by far and away the most popular. Why is that, and is that a problem?
This is a fantastic chart. Just 2 things I want to point out. The reason it's that red part is so large is because we have figured out how to make it a profitable business.
Right.
That particular. Just want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
All that red thing is all in rich countries. Very little of that red thing is in the countries we need that finance to go to. 3% of that finance goes to Africa right now. 3%. So I don't think we should get too excited about that graph.
But Vera, is it the case that development money goes for easy or profitable wins?
It is true. Development money goes for easy. It also goes for profitable. What we need to do is make sure that easy and profitable are also in the emerging countries. And they actually are, except that when you look at, say, for example, right now, we have the inflation crisis in the developed world. And what that is leading to is huge and expensive cost for emerging market economy projects, which adds to the cost of financing, adds to the cost of de-risking, makes it a little bit more difficult to go there, even if they are actually more profitable, even if there is less defaults in those emerging market environments.
But you can understand to some extent the public response, can't you? If you've got soaring inflation, things are costing much more money than perhaps they did 5-10 years ago, that people are going to cut back on the projects that you're talking about.
But that's why we need the EIBs and the World Banks of the world, because we need cheaper financing. The moment you have cheaper financing, it is actually better and more interesting to be able to go to EIB and do a project in Egypt than it is to go to US Exim or DFC and do a project in the United States. But we're not seeing that today. So what we need is, one, more information about those bankable projects in the developing and emerging world. Secondly, more concessional financing. In the report that we did with Nick Stern asking for $1 trillion, we are actually saying we can leverage that 1 to 5 if we are actually able to do that, and it's much, much cheaper. And finally, the reason why we need cheaper financing is just if we had inflation go by 1 more percentage point, any borrowing between now, 2021, and the next 5 years is going to cost emerging markets $25 billion for middle-income countries and $2.5 billion for low income. This is actually what we're asking for to be able to do this project. So it's actually cheaper to put the money in and do the investment as opposed to letting these countries go to the market at higher rates.
Do you want to respond to what Vera said about cheaper financing?
I can't talk about the pricing differentials, but I think it's really crucial that we also price the loans, we and everybody else, so that we put into the equation the externalities. We have to take into account, for example, we don't have a carbon pricing efficient globally. It's probably a long way to go. But everybody, we do this, and I believe World Bank does this as well. We can count in a shadow carbon pricing and see what happens to the attractiveness of these investments if there is a real carbon price on data. The same goes with the natural capital, biodiversity, and so on. I think this will also make the pricing look much more attractive for the developing countries, because they have a higher share. For example, as somebody said in the previous panel, biodiversity is biggest around equator, and that would play in. So just adding to what Vera was saying, I agree. Going a bit further.
Annie, you wanted to respond? I'll come to you, Catherine.
I just want to say one thing about the Vera thing about pricing, and we always talk about there's not enough money and it's expensive and the place is not going to the right place. I also want to point out that the evidence, at least that exists today, that if we did these things, if we built good food systems, if we cleaned up the air, if we actually invest in renewable energy, our estimation is that the economy itself, which is about $100 trillion right now, will be $26 trillion larger.
So why doesn't it happen?
Exactly. So we have to talk about these are good investments. What's not happening is the transition is difficult. Is actually where we are right now, that there is the outcome is actually very good. I hope our political leaders would talk more about that outcome. The transition is difficult because the money is sitting in the wrong places, there are risks in different places, and that we are not working together to get the transition right. I mean, that is what Mark is going to talk after us. This is where philanthropic dollars should go to the most riskiest thing. Because that curve that is making those two things profitable, we're not profitable 10 years back. So people made investments on it to make them profitable.
Right, so if you could unlock it, is it a political block, purely, Vera, then in that case that's stopping it?
I mean, as I started saying, it is leadership to start with, but it is leadership with information, knowledge, and data to be able to track it. And I think if we had that, today we say that the green economy is the economy of the next century. The green and the digital is going to be the economy of the next century. We need to demonstrate that. We're already seeing that with electric vehicles, right? Economies that have moving to electric vehicles are beginning to power themselves. They're beginning to get more jobs. And we are seeing we're sitting in the United States. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act and what it had, the impact it has had on U.S. growth, right? We're reducing inflation. There is the fight to slow down the economy. The economy is actually growing because there's been a huge investment in renewable infrastructure and industry. I think that kind of growth and that story needs to be told so that we can take it to other places. But people need to see it to believe it.
Well, are you getting the information out there, Catherine?
We're certainly working on it. But as Annie pointed out, change is expensive. It's not only do we have to rearrange what we're doing, but psychologically it requires effort to change. It is a lot easier to just go on with the status quo. And so we have to make that investment, which is not purely financial. It is the time and it is the effort to think about and find different ways to do things, to consider that it could be done differently, or there are completely other things that we should be doing. And so when you get over that hump, like he said many times, you will end up in a better place than you started. But we have to recognize that it takes that investment.
Well, Ayla, one of the changes that is expected this week is an institutional change. Could this help? I mean, big institutions pretty much in any sector can struggle with communication, coordination and bureaucracy, and criticisms that we've all heard about the way international development works. And you mentioned, Annie, waste in certain agricultural projects, but there are moves afoot to address that. Let's just take a look at this.
We can sign deals for millions of euros with the best of intentions, using the most sophisticated financial instruments, but what really matters is for that assistance to reach the communities it is intended for. The agreements we've signed with our partners at the UN family draw on our respective strengths and expertise. They will help us to get projects off the ground, to deliver our support more quickly and effectively, whether for climate action, clean and efficient energy, or for healthcare. And they will allow us to work in parts of the world that are most in need and where conditions are the most challenging.
Ayla, it looks and sounds great, this agreement that's expected between the EIB and parts of the UN family, but how, at a practical level, the question was raised in the film, is it going to change people's lives and these projects are going to get off the ground?
I think it will, because right now what happens with multilaterals is that we all provide technical assistance, capacity building. But what tends to happen is that you have somebody first in a partner country who has thought that we will do these investments. And then you go to an MDB, you go to EIB, and they will offer you the technical assistance. They tell you how to do it maybe a bit more efficiently, or so that it has a bigger impact and so on. But what we miss is that few steps upstream capacity building, go on the ground and educate people in the communities and in the countries themselves, so that they know what to do and they will know where you have the biggest impact if you have this kind of money available. So get the people the tools to imagine themselves what they can do, instead of somebody coming from the outside always and telling that this is what you have to do. And when they know what to do, where the biggest impact is, you get the bigger impact for your money and you get stuff done. This is President Obama said that he was giving career advice, and he said just focus on getting the stuff done. And I think it also applies very well on development finance. Just focus on getting the stuff done and getting the biggest possible impact for your money. But you don't get it if you do not nurture this at the beginning of the process, at the very upstream level.
Has Ayla convinced you, Vera, with her argument?
Yes, I think also that what she wanted to say is that we need to do faster, but we also need to do at scale. I think one of the things that we see is a lot of little pilot projects, but we never see those pilots go to scale, and we never know, we've heard for the last year, for example, about the Ecuador green bond. Why can we finance the second and the third and the fourth green bond? We talk about, debt for debt swaps, debt for climate swaps. So we know how to do it. If Ecuador was successful, if Barbados was successful, then let's just get on with it and do 20 more.
Right, well,
and quickly.
Well, why not, Ayla? If something works, why isn't it then scaled up?
To be honest, I don't have an answer to that, but I think people will have to be aware that this can be done, because you do the pilot project with somebody, but do other people who have similar situations, do they know about it? I really don't have an answer to that, but with a kind of much wider capacity building and extension of the relations to the communities, I think one should make this happen. And it probably doesn't happen at the scale that it's needed. And that's why I think this agreement that we have now with the UN agencies, who have a good presence on the spots and who will know the local circumstances and who will know where the biggest impact is being had, I think this can be very beneficial.
Catherine?
Yes, I think that your point was very well made. We know that we have financial mechanisms such as debt for nature deals that work. There have been dozens of them, but we need thousands of them. At the Nature Conservancy, we've calculated, I think we need about 6,000 to really conserve the land and water on which all life depends and put carbon back in the soil and ecosystems. So we have a mechanism, and it needs to happen faster. So it isn't about, like you said, waiting for something new to come along. It's about saying, here's what works. Everybody needs to go for these things.
So what would be the bridge then, Annie? If Ayla is saying we can provide the sort of impetus to get something off the ground, and then someone else or something else has to take it to scale in the way Vera is saying, what's missing?
So I'm glad Vera is here, because Vera has done a lot of work on MDBs in general. My view is, I actually, just for disclosure, we work with AIB and we have partnership with them, and they're doing a fantastic job. But I do think if you look at the macro picture where the finances are of the world, and people like Vera and others have argued we need $1 trillion. Some people actually argue much more than $1 trillion than here. And if you take all the multilateral banks and all the bilateral banks together, they add up to what, $260 billion. And all the philanthropic dollars, they add up to $4 billion. Okay? So the gap, the minimum gap is $700-800 billion. People actually calculate it's much more than that. So where would that money come from? Most probably will come from better use of public resources and a lot from private sector. We think MDBs of the world have to do two things, is to figure out how to de-risk that $700 billion and how to help countries have policies that attract the $700 billion. So I think a system change is required if you want to get to that $1 trillion and not just projects.
Well, let's just continue with that theme in terms of A, getting the finance out, but B, also making it better value for African countries, particularly Vera. Let me just show you and everybody here this clip. It was from an event Project Syndicate did last month entitled Africa's Climate Agenda.
Only 2% of all financing in renewables has gone into Africa. So, and this is despite having 60% of the world's best solar, wind that can power the world 50 times over. This is very, very disappointing. But in addition to that, the cost of debt, so the cost of actual money that we need to bring the projects off the ground is also higher in Africa. So we're paying 30% more than anywhere else in the world. This really needs to be eradicated.
Why is this still going on, Vera? And we've just heard that. We know it, but it still continues.
I think there are two things. I mean, one of the things that I do, I co-chair the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, and part of what we do at the LSF is really to try to see if we can create a secondary market for Africa paper. Because of the lack of a secondary market for Africa paper, it's not liquid enough. And so nobody wants to come and buy African bonds that they have to hold. And so it adds about a 1 percentage point. The second one is just that there is not enough information. Ernst & Young has done a report that shows actually that of all the energy projects, and that's probably why you see the infrastructure on the investment going up, that have been done in Africa, even through COVID, we didn't have any defaults. People paid. But I don't think there is enough information about that in the system. The second one is, the third problem is the FX risk, right? In an environment where, we have inflation, where we have a potential, a recontracting of economies, there's a flight to safety. So everybody comes to the dollar, which means investing in emerging markets becomes more expensive. But I think with all of these things, that's again where MDBs are important. The 260 billion that we're asking for MDBs is so that they can also release some of this information, make it clear that investing in Egypt, investing in Kenya, investing in Senegal is profitable business, it's good business, it's secure business, and it's good for the climate. I think we need to be able to say that and say it consistently, but also demonstrate it in the numbers, and it shows in the numbers. But we need the MDBs to be those first movers. I think today, and in the report that we're working on, is sometimes we find the MDBs waiting behind because they don't have enough capital sometimes, because they're not aware of the different things. But we think if we are able to come together, leadership, and do it well, then it will actually happen. And this is, I think, this credit differential is a particularly pernicious point, and we must break it. If we cannot break it, it's going to be very difficult. The good thing is Africa is doing something to break it. Africa is bringing together its pension funds, which have long-term cheap capital to invest in these projects. With long-term cheap capital from the continent, we don't have the exchange rate risk, but we're also investing in our own futures, and that's happening. Recently, we had 18 African pension funds come together to put money together to do this. The second thing that Africa can do is recycle assets. We do already have energy assets all over the continent. All you need to do is trade that in. Use those resources to bring down the cost of the project. Some of this is happening, but we need MDBs to come behind some of these efforts to help push them even further.
Catherine, you wanted to say something.
Yes, so imagine a long line of dominoes that takes us to a better future. And it twists and wends, and there's one way to knock those dominoes over, which is one at a time. And that's to a certain extent what we've been doing. But then there's another way, which is what you're talking about, which is you examine that long row of dominoes, and where are the dominoes that if you knocked that one over, it would take 3, 5, 8 with it. And one of the biggest dominoes is communication. Just sharing the information and data and stories about what worked, how it worked, the benefits that there were, not just for people, but for the people who invested in it. Because, as you pointed out, it is not enough for philanthropy, for MDVs to be doing this by themselves. We need everyone. And for that, communication is a big domino.
I mean, it's sometimes said that aid money, Annie, for example, particularly from Western governments, comes with too many strings attached. Do you agree?
Yeah. Not only it comes with too many strings attached, it's also fragmented. I've worked in many countries in Africa. There are multiple initiatives on the same topic that are not talking to each other. I'm a strong advocate for a country to have its own plan, and people actually finance that plan. Most people who work in the sector believe that, but that's not what's happening. Even donors, if you talk to them, they will say they totally believe in that, but then they'll go and do a bilateral project. No, it is not aggregated. I just want to point out that donor capital is actually relatively small compared to what's needed. If that capital is not used to actually de-risk the system, we will not get the capital we need. We will keep doing projects.
Let's pick up on your point, Catherine, about communication. And in this particular case, a legal case, a battle that was won by a group of young activists in Montana. Let's have a look at the news report.
A win for climate justice and for Montana's youth. In a landmark trial, the state fought hard to suppress but couldn't.
You know, it's really scary seeing what you care for disappear right in front of your eyes.
Are legal cases like this, Catherine, the way forward?
There's no silver bullet, but there's plenty of silver buckshot. And what that means is we need everything on the table. So we've been talking primarily about finance. But we know that we also need the private sector at the table. We need the legal sector at the table. And young people are really showing and providing and leading as an example of how to use your voice to affect change using the levers in our society, identifying the dominoes that if you knock that domino over, and that took a lot of work, and that was not the first lawsuit by youth. There have been a number of lawsuits by youth. I remember 20 years ago was the first lawsuit that I heard of that I was involved in on behalf of an Alaskan village. But one by one, identifying those places where if you knock something over, it could take a lot more with it. And we need all of those.
Vera, I know you have to go in a moment, but perhaps some final thoughts from you before you leave us about what you've heard.
I think where we started, leadership. We have the answers. We've all talked about the answers. We know where to go get the resources. I think, again, the private sector, philanthropy, the NDBs have never before come together as they are coming together in this moment. So I think there is an awareness of the urgency. There is an acceptance. We started with were the goals too ambitious? No, they weren't. So if we have, we know the goals were not too ambitious. We have philanthropy, private sector, and everybody in the room. We just need the leadership to get it done. And I think this is probably the big message of this our week is, can we get that leadership together to decide the $1 trillion in external financing, $260 billion for MDBs, including the EIB, are the important way to go forward, as long as they promise that they'll leverage it and use it to de-risk and blend and make sure that we can go to scale quickly.
Well, I can't guarantee that they will keep to that promise, but do you think it will make a real difference this week, this meeting at the United Nations General Assembly?
It will certainly, I think, push the ball forward. It is important that we keep communicating some of these goals as we are doing today. For the financing community, we just got from the G20 very positive readouts. We're waiting for Marrakesh, which is where the financing community decides and makes decisions. So I think this week is important so that Marrakesh becomes successful.
Vera Songway, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much. Careful you don't drop that on your foot. It's time to hear from some journalists with their questions. And first of all, we have a question from Ryan MacDonald, Senior Editor, Climate, Environment and Resource at the Globe and Mail in Canada. Here's his question.
My question has to do with the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, which is in jeopardy. Progress is stalled or has even been reversed in some cases. And this is all happening in a world in which we are experiencing the climate crisis in real time every day around the world, along with an economic downturn. How do we reignite a sense of hope and optimism in the context of all these events?
Hope and optimism. Who would like to take the question? Catherine?
So I'm a climate scientist. And because of what I do, when I speak to people all across the United States and around the world, I started realizing a few years ago that that question that was rising to the top with every single group of people I was speaking to was the same. I could be speaking to school children, I could be speaking to academic colleagues, I could be speaking to healthcare professionals or Catholic nuns. The same question rose to the top every single time, and that question was, what gives you hope? Or sometimes the flip side, are we screwed? And so I set out to answer that question because if we don't have hope, why act, right? And I realized that hope is not wishful thinking. Hope is not focusing on the positive. Hope is what you need when things are at their worst point. So as he just said so eloquently, and I have to say I love the Canadian content here as a Canadian, as he just said, we are at a bad place, which means we need hope more than ever because we're at a bad place. Hope consists of 4 ingredients: recognizing that we need it, envisioning the better future that is possible if we act, plotting out a path from A to B, and then showing every single person what they can do to move us along that path. That is how we generate the hope.
Well, that was compelling in terms of your response. Let's take another question, this time from the audience here. And we have Alexis, who's the managing editor at Sem4 Africa. Alexis, your question.
I'm very much focused on African news and current affairs, and with that in mind, I'm wondering about the implications of the wave of coups we've seen recently in West and Central Africa. So with that in mind, I wanted to get your thoughts on what impact do you see these coups having on climate finance investment and development finance?
Annie?
So I'm not a political scientist, but this is very much as concerned us because we work in the same region, especially in the Congo Basin. And I do think 2 things that happened at the same time. The Africa Climate Summit that created a lot of positive momentum in Nairobi, and these coups happened in a month's span, actually. I think our understanding from that is there's many complexity in the coups and what's going to happen in the future. What we are concerned about is that the path for development that is actually in the Congo Basin, which we have worked a lot more than in Niger. Our understanding from our teams are that what they're hearing, that the path is still, the path towards development, things we were working on, are not being destabilized yet. But this is early days of what these new regimes and new governments will do. So it's of a deep concern. That particular region is a very important region for the world, not just for the set of countries. And we are very focused. We have teams there that we are working with. And we are very focused on actually specifically on that area region is what's happening in Gabon, what's happening in Congo region. So I can't tell you more because it's early days. We are very much in touch. But what we are hearing so far, and Catherine, I don't know if you're following this too, is that none of these things that we were working on the forest protection, on the things have not been dismantled yet or had plans to. That's what I know so far. But, I think we have to watch what's going on there.
I mean, just briefly as a follow-up, though, is there a concern that there will be a financial flight from this part of the world if they deem instability to be on the way?
I must say this is too early to know, at least from what I'm seeing right now.
Alexis, thank you very much for your question. Let's have another question, and Ayla, hopefully, who can respond to this one. It's from Mustafa Tombou, who is a journalist in Senegal, and his question is on phasing out fossil fuels.
What are the guarantees for the state that the abandonment of these fossil fuels as a guarantee of certain development will not handicap them?
Ayla, I hope you could catch all that question.
Getting energy generated or electricity and selling that is, of course, it's not a spending issue, it is actually an investment issue. So whether you invest in a fossil fuel and get money from that, or you invest in renewable energy and sell that and get your income from that is two sides of the same coin. The other one is just climate-wise much better. So I think it has to be seen that also the benefit of that renewable energy that is produced in, for example, in an African country, stays there, that they sell at the market price, and they can also finance things at a market rate. So I think there is no quick and totally efficient guarantee, but like I said, these are cash flow generating investments, and the good thing with renewable energy, if we talk about wind and solar, is that when you have built it, I mean, you have a short initial period of building up the plants, but from then on, the fuel is free. So anything you earn from it is all income. You don't need to pay the fuel to somebody else. So I think one needs to see it as an investment, not as spending or sort of giving up income. And there is more and more demand for that kind of electricity. So I think this is really the way forward. Fossil fuel, whatever we think today, whatever the war in Ukraine has caused short-time effects, it's transitory, it's going to go away. So it's not a long-term prospective investment. I think the renewable energy is. So that's as much as guarantee I can give you.
Well, we'll stick with that then, Ayla, but thank you very much for the answer to that question. I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions because the conversation is almost at an end, except I want to thank our guest again, Vera Songwe, who of course has left, Catherine Hayhoe, Ayla Craver, who has just answered that question, Annie Dasgupta. A round of applause for all of them. To wrap up today's event, I'd like to introduce Mark Malloch-Brown to come up to the lectern, former Deputy United Nations Secretary General and President of the Open Society Foundations. Welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you. Joe, thanks. Nice to see you.
Yes, likewise.
Nice to see a lot of friends in the room. Having sort of listened earlier online and having joined that last session, I suppose one or three problems come through as perhaps the core of this. Leadership, leadership, leadership. We might add communications, but I'm really struck, and I'm struck by a veteran of this, having sat through sessions of this kind as head of UNDP, as a vice president of the World Bank before that, as Kofi Annan's deputy later, and in many other roles, in some ways, the failure of the agenda to move forward. I think it's right and encouraging, as Vera said, that philanthropy, the private sector, the MDBs, the UN have come together at one level in ways which confound the past to some extent, but which is still too little too late. And so we're gathering on the eve of an SDG summit, a halfway point review, and we find that by its 140 metrics, half are not on the desired trajectory to be met by 2030, and a third have stalled or gone into reverse. And for all the encouraging things that we've heard this morning about potential partnerships around additional finance, none of it yet adds up to the numbers that everybody, I think, agrees are needed. We're struggling with a series of interlocked pathologies that hold us back. The first is the one that Bogolo and Laurence in the earlier session touched on, the trust deficit, if you like, the failure of the international system since the Paris summit to come through on the commitments made. And it has its ramifications. It really does look as though the formal adoption of the declaration following the SDG summit is going to get kicked down the road. There may not even be a proper outcome from the preparatory meeting of the Summit of the Futures on Thursday. Now, this is both that general trust deficit, but a second pathology, which is very much a UN one in character. The UN is simply getting bypassed. Its relevance every year less than it was. It was my job to sit on the podium at the General Assembly when the Secretary General couldn't, and see a stream of G7, G20 global leaders pass through to give their speeches. My successor today is going to have a much easier time of it because the leaders aren't here. They're not here. And in that sense, the crisis of relevance of the United Nations is, I think, much bigger than many people want to admit. Those who work in the organization find it an uncomfortable truth, best pushed aside. Those outside don't really notice. And, already the talk moves on to a Marrakesh and the World Bank meetings, to COP, etc. But to the third pathology, which is the thing that the UN does do better than others, which is to collate the whole, to link the politics to the environment, to the development. And here we just see this issue of the bits not adding up, that the scale of the problems confronting this General Assembly, a demographic shift in the world as Africa and other regions grow, others start to literally contract. The extraordinary impact of climate change on patterns and locations of settlement around the world, and knock-on effects like migration. The future potential dramatic impact of AI on the structure of employment around the world. And we look to a forum like UNGA for solutions in vain. They're not there. The leadership is utterly and totally missing. And it's not a West versus South or East versus North. It is a reality that today's politics, with the dramatic impact on the amount of democracy in the world, the respect for human rights in the world, that in this very constrained environment, this environment of pinched political opportunity, there are almost no leaders out there with the stomach, let alone the vision, to talk about tomorrow's problems. And when pressed, they will say, well, they are tomorrow's problems. They're not about putting food on the table today, helping the insecurity of our voters now. But I would argue they are the solution, not just to the problems of tomorrow, but the problems of today, the problems of investment, employment, and growth, which so threaten the world in which we are living now. And at Open Society, we last week launched a now annual barometer on the state of democracy. And I won't trouble you with it. You can find it online at OSF Open Society Barometer. But let me just quickly quote a couple of findings around multilateralism. At a time leaders don't even come to New York and shy away from commitments or putting the bits together, people are somewhere else. This poll, which covered 36 countries representing almost 6 billion of world population, so included countries like China and Russia and many others, we found that 68% of those countries, including Western donor countries, felt there should be more funds to the World Bank. 75% were in favor of high-income countries increasing their overseas aid. And 84% said that lenders should act to help indebted countries. There is a spirit of generosity out there in the politics of nations, democratic, authoritarian, whatever, which is not matched in their leadership. There is a place where this comes together, which is younger people are distinctly more skeptical about the potential of democracy than their elders, because they're seeing it's not delivering. But they're also more skeptical about government more generally, because they're seeing it's not delivering. And so the crisis of relevance that Unger faces today is, I would just argue, the tip of a much, much bigger iceberg. Where is leadership? Where is the articulation and narrative of a vigorous response to the problems that are clearly mounting and gaining ground all around us? And so to Project Syndicate, thank you for pulling us all together. Thank you for being about communication above all else, not just today, but in your product every day of the year. Because unless we debate these issues, unless we ultimately find leaders willing to step forward and articulate bold change, we're headed down a very large rabbit hole. Thank you very much.
Mark Mallock-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations, thank you very much. With that sober assessment about the current state of leadership when it comes to fighting climate change. It's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to all of our contributors for making this such a wonderful event. Echoing what Mark was saying, thanks to everyone behind the scenes at Project Syndicate and High Impact who've worked so hard to make this happen. But most of all, thank you to you, of course, the audience watching and those here with us today. Thank you for tuning in. We'd like to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors and partners, including the European Investment Bank, the Global Strategic Communications Council, the Nature Conservancy, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung New York, the European Climate Foundation, and High Impact. I'm Jo Coburn, and this has been Climate and Development Finance, What Works, brought to you by Project Syndicate. Goodbye.
you.